Well, good morning, Rob. I am so honored to have you here. You are in an unusual position today because normally you are interviewing lots of people in the community all through the nation, statewide, locally, about the issues going on with public education. So this is a rare treat for the public to have a chance to pick your brain and all the things that have to do with public schools in North Carolina. So, Rob, you were so gracious to come and join us a couple of weeks ago at our conference, The Impact of Privatizing Public Schools. And we are honored that you agreed to come back today where we could have a little bit more time to go more in depth on the subject about what's going on with public education in North Carolina. And I wanted to make sure that the public knows a little bit about you. Of course, you are well known as the director of the NC Policy Watch. You've been there for decades. Many people don't know that you are trained in the legal profession. They think of you more as a writer. And of course, you are a commentator and a writer, but you also have a keen legal mind and bring all of these things to looking at how the laws are put together and how they impact public education. So we really appreciate that. Progressive Pulse is a nonpartisan blog about issues, debates, and people that affect North Carolina public policy. Rob, I always look forward to all of your radio broadcasts, and I really think that when we think about influencers in North Carolina, you're at the top of that list. And so having you here with us today is quite an honor. And just for your information, if we aren't able to get many early birds out this morning, on early Saturday morning, we'll be okay because we are going to record this conversation. It will be on our website, and we hope to share it out because this is a gift to the state of North Carolina to have your views here today with us. And so I want to kind of jump into, Rob, you know, the conference was totally focused on school privatization and how that was impacting things in terms of how our schools function and operate, and certainly in terms of segregation. A lot of people have asked me, what is this all about and how is it going on? And I thought it'd be really cool. I've kind of put a little definition on the screen for our viewers, but I'd really appreciate it if you could kind of talk about it from your perspective of spending your professional career looking at these kind of issues.
Sure. Well, thanks, Yvonne. Yes, I am a recovering lawyer. I do direct a project called NC Policy Watch. It's at ncpolicywatch.com. We've got reporters covering state government, and we have a dedicated education reporter, Greg Childress, who's following it and writing news stories on it, stories that the mainstream media often misses. So we're proud of the content we produce. We'll send you lots of free emails if you check us out. This was something, the work at this conference, the work of Public Schools First in resisting the trends of privatization and resegregation of our schools actually overlap with a lot of the work we do at NC Policy Watch, because the debate over the future of government, the debate over the future of the common good in our society is something we focused a lot of attention on. So this is not something that's unique to education. The fact that we have very powerful forces that are trying to remake our society in a more, I think they have the notion that it's more of a free market kind of a situation. But the reality is that for decades, there's been a move to privatize our public schools. It really first, in the United States, one of the first manifestations of that was back in the middle of the last century, in which we had Brown versus Board of Education. This was something discussed at length during the event that we had, the Public Schools First event last month. The Brown versus Board of Education had ordered American schools to integrate as quickly as possible, and there was immediately a resistance, particularly in the South, but all over the country, to that. And one of the schemes for avoiding the integration of the schools to move in this direction of effectively of vouchers and charters, and it really hasn't ever changed since then. It's kind of ebbed and flowed through the years. We've had a real renaissance, if you will. That's maybe not too positive a term, but a real growth in the whole movement of vouchers and charters in the last few decades. And again, it's often billed in this way that, well, you know, this is all American. It's all about choice. It's all about freedom. It's all about consumerism. It plays to American prejudices in favor of advertising and consumerism. We all want to get the best possible deal we can get for ourselves at the cheapest possible price. And so when you get a glossy brochure from a company that's promising to give your kids all kinds of great benefits and the cheap, with public funds, it sounds like it's too good to be true. And it's hard for folks to resist, especially if maybe the school that they send their kids to is a little dog-eared and it's a little frightening. And maybe those parents didn't have the greatest experience in public schools themselves. They look back on it with some mixed feelings and say, oh, wow, this looks great. I got a brochure here. It says they're going to give my kid all these new innovative techniques. And it's all going to be free, or I'm going to get a voucher to make it almost free. So it's a very alluring thing. And I think that's part of the battle we're involved here, because the folks at the traditional public schools don't have that at their disposal. They don't have an advertising machine for the most part to compete in that so-called debate over choice. So we've got really a whole long list. I wrote this column the week after we had the event, in which I listed a dozen things that I think were takeaways from the conference that speak to the issue of how charters and vouchers are having a negative impact on our public schools. Folks can check it out at ncpolicywatch.com or at our Facebook page. But here's a few of the things I came up with as I went through the list of all the things we talked about at the conference. It's clear that charters and vouchers do not reflect the racial and ethnic makeups of the counties in which they are located. Originally, they were supposed to, or at least charters were, but that's been done away with. And as a practical matter, we have the private schools that we're sending, or the charter schools and private schools that we're sending public money to, are disproportionately segregated by race, by income, and so it's just abetting a problem that's been there for a long time and we've never, effectively solved in our country.
True.
Another thing was a takeaway for me as someone who's not a full-time expert in education, but something was good to be reminded of, is how charters and vouchers have no obligation to take on kids with special needs, or to provide a free lunch to children or free transportation to low-income children. So there's just a natural cherry-picking process that takes place in the charter and voucher world as a result of that. We also have the phenomenon of how charters and vouchers frequently expel challenging kids and send them back to the traditional public schools. That's, we've got this kid, he's a pain, he's causing trouble in school, he's out of here, because we know that the traditional public school has to accept him. There's no choice in the matter. So that's also a frequent phenomenon that we see, and that also tends to abet that cherry picking and resegregation. We have the phenomenon of how the General Assembly has allowed charter schools to really explode in the two largest systems in the state, in Wake County and Mecklenburg County, which tend to actually have progressive leadership of their school boards who are skeptical of this move to privatize, but they've sort of been overruled by the folks at the state level. So we've had this explosion of charters in our two largest counties. We have the phenomenon, at least with respect to voucher schools, of how voucher schools literally discriminate and are, there's no law banning it. They discriminate against children based on their parents' religion, based on their parents' marital status, their sexual orientation. They literally, you're the child of a gay couple, you're not going to be admitted to our voucher school. Most of these voucher schools, of course, are religiously based. So that's another phenomenon. We're literally sending our tax dollars to places that will only accept people of certain religions and of certain points of view. We also see the phenomenon as an aside in many of these voucher schools, where we are literally teaching children creationism and other views of how the world developed that are anti-science. So that's
hey, Rob, I want to show you, I'm going to skip over here and show you something really fast that you're saying that, because it's just, look at that.
Yeah, number of vouchers. Yeah, right, by school curriculum. Yeah.
So you can see there, this is exactly what you were just saying. We just charted this looking through not this current, but last school year. And you can see the green and the blue. That is Christian literal biblical worldview, Christian curriculum unknown. This is where your money, your private tax dollars, is going to fund children attending these religious-based curriculum.
There's a fascinating development this week, maybe it was last week before, in Ohio, where there has been legislation now introduced in their General Assembly, which presumably we could expect to see at some point here, that literally says that if your child gets a wrong answer on a science test because they disagree with the basic premise of it, that they will not be penalized for that. So when your child, if this legislation went into effect, if your child failed to answer a question on the, let's say, the age of the Earth being 4.6 billion years on a science exam and said it was 6,000 years old because they're a believer in creationism, they couldn't be penalized for that. That's how far this is being taken at this point. It's pretty remarkable. So
well, you mentioned that, and I have to say that when you say it might be coming here soon, and that's kind of related to that concept that you and I have talked about before, which is ALEC, which is an organization that maybe you could kind of explain a little bit to our public, because there are still a lot of people who do not understand why this legislation is so rapidly spread on these topics around the state, around the nation.
The folks that introduced these bills in the North Carolina General Assembly aren't thinking these ideas by and large up by themselves. And these ideas, North Carolina didn't invent the movement to privatize public education. There's a national movement. ALEC is one of the groups behind that, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a national, primarily corporate funded, very conservative organization that has an array of very specific policy proposals that it puts forth in public education, but in dozens of other areas, tax policy, you name it. They've got the conservative far-right recipe for your state government. And here in North Carolina, through the years, we've also got some local think tanks, locally based organizations that have affiliations with ALEC, groups like the John Locke Foundation, the Pope Civitas Institute, there's a school privatization group that's name is Parents for Educational Freedom, an array of organizations that are very tied to a national network that has an agenda, and you got to give them credit to the extent that they are determined, they're well funded, they work hard. Most of the folks behind it are true believers. I think they're very misguided, but they have an agenda, and it's something that we need to be aware of, that folks who care about public education and realize that it is the bulwark of our society, we're in a battle to preserve it. There are very strong forces behind a movement, literally, to do away with it. If you listen to conservative talk radio, I sometimes go on to debate with some of the folks on the other side. They don't even refer to public schools as public schools anymore. They refer to them as government schools. It's sort of meant as a derogatory term. They reject some very basic premises that we thought had sort of been decided in this country, that public education was, a universal phenomenon that we should all participate in, and that
a common good.
It's the glue that holds together our society in so many ways. And that very basic premise is under assault. And again, these charter and voucher proposals, although they're often cloaked in terminology that it's about choice, it's about supporting the public schools, in reality, I think they have a darker, more sinister long-term agenda with where they really want to take things.
I think I must say this term, you see in this chart, we're kind of being bullheaded here, because we're calling this vouchers, a number of vouchers. And of course, that they call them opportunity scholarship. Right. So the language that ALEC and others have used in their model, quote, take this template we've written on a bill you could introduce in your General Assembly, is the language is always fascinating to me. You were trained as a lawyer. You were trained in how to convince people of your case and how to use language, and they are pretty good at it, right?
There's no doubt about it. And we should point out, this hasn't always been exclusively a partisan divide. This hasn't just been R's against D's and blues against reds. The charter school law in North Carolina was advanced with the support of Democrats in the North Carolina General Assembly. And there was, at least for a time, I think maybe some people really believed it, that there was a notion that charter schools were going to be so-called incubators of innovation. They were going to come up with all these, we're going to loosen the reins on them so they were free to make some mistakes, but come up with lots of great ideas that would then percolate through the traditional public schools. But of course, that hasn't happened. The ideas that they've come up with are things like smaller class size and modern textbooks and, slick advertising. Those are things that, I guess if we had enough funding for our traditional public schools, we'd like to have smaller class sizes and more individualized attention, all those kinds of things. So we really haven't seen that phenomenon of the incubator of innovation. And in many ways, I think even the folks who are the charter champions have kind of sheepishly, they don't talk about that too much anymore.
Well, Rob, to support your point, recently a group of parents in Northeast Wake County went to the State Board of Education to speak about, hey, we are showing you these new charters that are opening up. They are offering no program, nothing that we don't already have in our school system. They are offering no curriculum, no approach to dealing with low achieving students that we're not doing within 5 miles of this new charter school. And they pushed and challenged that you meet the law, that it has to be innovative, that it has to be doing something unique, serving a special population of children. And because of the reins on the decisions about charter schools have been loosened up so much, the State Board of Education, along with the Special Advisory Committee on Charter Schools, said, well, that's probably true, but we have to approve them. And even though so they have the impact of what's going on in Northeast Wake County is pretty devastating. They have something like 10 charters within 10 miles of each other and within their public education system. And you can imagine what's happening is that as they pull kids out of these schools, our regular public schools, their enrollment is down. The benefit for the taxpayers is being diminished, right? Because we built these schools. Now we're seeing these kids being pulled out. So it's a very, yeah, and the economics of it, I'm wondering if you've had a chance to talk about that recently, but I don't want to sidetrack you from your top 10.
Right.
Let me let you go back to that, but I do want some point for you to talk about maybe what is the 70% of people, me and you, are in that group who don't have kids in the K through 12 system right now. Yeah. What's our economic value here, and what's the impact that's going on to us? Because I think that's a group of people, these citizens are working hard. We work hard. We pay our taxes. It's going into this system of educating our children. Are we really getting the appropriate value for what we're doing?
Obviously, the principal thing that we as individuals who don't have children in the schools anymore, what we want is we want a robust, successful education system that will produce the next generation of leaders for our society, that will produce the high-skilled workers that will fill the jobs of the 21st century economy. There's obviously a direct link between the well-being of a society, both near-term and long-term, as to how well-educated its children are. So we have a strong vested interest. I mean, if there were anything in society that we, from my estimation, that we would want to spend even wastefully on, it would be our kids, much less, So to me, it's an obvious that the public education system is absolutely critical. One of the key problems with the charter and voucher movement is that they have really no accountability. What the folks on their champions will say was, well, people will vote with their feet if the schools don't succeed. But what has happened in many, many instances with charter schools is that they have literally gone belly up in the middle of the school year because we have so few checks. Our Greg Childress has done some reports at NC Policy Watch, and he's working on some more stories about some of these really remarkably fly-by-night operators who come into a situation sort of like, the Harold, what's his name, in The Music Man, and he's got to sell you a deal, and then we're going to turn your school into this great, amazing turnaround, and it's really all a shell game. We've got corporations from out of state. We've got private operators coming in basically with the goal of making money off of managing charter schools. They want to extract a profit, and they sell parents a bill of goods. Look, we're going to produce all these amazing results. But when the school goes belly up in the middle of the school year, well, that's just tough. The kids, filter back into the traditional public schools. The results in the charter schools, some charter schools have done great. There's no doubt about it. Generally, that happens with charter schools that have wealthy, whiter populations. They've got requirements that you have to be, if it's a high school, you have to already sort of had pre-algebra before you get in there. There's all kinds of basic winnowing techniques that they use to sort of cherry pick the kids. And those schools, I mean, there's no doubt many of them done great, but we've had an awful lot of charters that have really just done very, very poorly. And it really raises the question, is that how we want to run our public education system? Do we want to have a system, as happens in a market economy, of winners and losers? I would argue that might make sense when you're out selling widgets in the traditional economy. When it comes to our public schools, we ought to be fighting desperately for a system in which we have nothing but winners, or we ought not to have egregious losers like we so often do in the charter and voucher world. So that's an important point to keep in mind. A couple other points from my top list I wanted to mention. Again, I think I just alluded to it, was how millions of taxpayer dollars are literally flowing to out-of-state corporations for shareholder profits, big executive salaries, lavish advertising budgets. Think about it. That's where our tax dollars go. They go to a company based, organized out of state that is then, quote unquote, managing our public charter school here in North Carolina and sucking out profits that are, if they do this on a big enough scale, then they can pay a CEO millions of dollars a year. And it really begs the question, is that how we want to run our public education system? Another point I took away, which one I hadn't really realized before I came to the event, was how high schools are a lot more expensive to run than elementary schools. I guess you think about it, of course, they've got to have all these extracurriculars in big facilities, and therefore they're a lot less attractive to investors who want to invest in these management operations.
The profit margin's very small.
Yeah, so I mean, you can extract a lot more money out of little kids than bigger kids. So that tends to be, there's less of a push to privatize in that realm. A lot of times we see this phenomenon of kids going to privatized elementary school or even homeschooled, and then they want to be on a basketball team, they want to be a cheerleader, they want to be on the science club, and lo and behold,
they want to have a science lab, they want to have,
right,
a media center, and learn how to broadcast like you, right? Yeah.
So I mean, I guess you could argue that that's one saving grace for the public education system, that it's an ace in the hole, if you will, that the public schools have. But why put ourselves in the hole like that? Another thing I learned about at the conference that I think has really played a role in this privatization, it's a little more subtle, is the way that state legislators in North Carolina have enacted this sort of crude, one-of-a-kind system for assessing and affixing letter grades to traditional public schools. We don't rate the charter schools. We have very little accountability there. But for traditional public schools, we've decided we're going to give them all a letter grade. You're going to be an A school, a B school, an F school. And that fits into this model of, it's choice. It's about parents having complete information. But because of the way we do it, we base it upon test scores that often don't take into account things like the actual demographics of the kids who might be attending a school, the resources it has. The grades are incredibly inaccurate. You can have a wonderful school that's doing great work, helping a lot of troubled kids, but because they score low on a standardized test, everybody gets the label D at that school. The parents, the teachers, everybody, and that obviously has a big impact on the attractiveness of that school. It plays then into real estate issues and how people buy homes and locate in particular neighborhoods. And again, that's based roughly on a model they tried in Florida. Senator, I guess this is from the current leadership of the General Assembly's really pushed this system through. It's not been very successful. There's been a lot of pushback saying we need to take other factors. If we're going to do this, we need to take other factors into account. I would argue whether even affixing a letter grade to a school is a good idea to begin with. But that's another example of the way we have sort of embedded this privatization. And we do the same thing actually with teachers too. We have sort of this was talked about by a lot of teachers at the conference, that we have this sort of crude, well, I don't know how crude it is, but it's a mysterious, privately developed evaluation system for evaluating our teachers that often produces very wildly inconsistent results. The teacher gets a terrible grade one year, a great grade the next year. Again, there's this link to test scores rather than really trusting the professionals and looking at the whole performance. And again, that sort of feeds into this privatization scheme.
Well, Rob, I would tell you two things as I've traveled across the state and visited with hundreds and hundreds of PTAs, and over the last 5 years, thousands of teachers and parents. And it is heartbreaking when I've literally had parents call me and say, I just found out my school's a C. Do you think I should move my kids? And I go, well, have you been happy? What grade is your child in? 4th grade. So for 5 years you've been at this school and you loved it and you loved your teachers and you think your kid's doing well. Yes. Then to get that letter, right? But that's what's happening. We have children, parents have called me and told me their children cry. We're our teachers are upset. They say we're a D school. And the kids and the teachers have taken this in, and it's a very soul damaging, I think, process of this scarlet letter that's been placed on our schools. And the General Assembly has been relentless in not allowing, even in this this measure that is questionable, allowing growth to be a fair part of saying that teachers are making progress with children who are struggling. When we look at our low performing children, Rob, you know how poverty is related to these scores. I mean, the higher the index of poverty is in your school, the more likely you are to have a D or an F. So it correlates with poverty. So that's kind of a cruel thing to me.
My wife was a special ed teacher in the Wake County schools for a long time. And I literally spent a lot of time washing clothes. I washed clothes in my own washing machine for her children who just didn't have anything at home, or who came to school hungry and exhausted every morning. And, that was a small microcosm of what we clearly know is a much broader problem. Perhaps a fifth of the children in North Carolina, battle hunger issues. How can you expect children in those circumstances, children who move a lot, their parents are forced to relocate multiple times, they're in a different school every year. It's so much to expect of those kids, but how can you expect a school to miraculously transform a child like that with so little support and so few resources in its own institution into, a high achieving, high test score achieving child? It's actually pretty remarkable what we ask our schools to perform and how little we give them to do the job. We know for a fact that one of the single best predictor of how a kid's going to do in testing is, their socioeconomic background. Do they have a healthy home life with decent resources? And when they don't have that, the challenges are enormous. And while some people will, there are some of the folks in the charter voucher movement who will sort of propose this sort of savior. We got this brilliant principal who's going to solve this problem for your child. It may happen on occasion, but as a general rule, when you're trying to do it on a big picture, the only way to really get after the problem of poverty and the challenges that so many children bring to school is to bring a holistic approach to it. Kids need access to health care. They need access to adequate food. They need, free meals whenever they can get them year round. They need free transportation. They need a decent place to live. Those are the kinds of wraparound services that we know work in attacking poverty. And it's sort of a sad commentary that we expect our schools to perform and to solve those problems with duct tape and baling wire, which is basically what so many schools have to operate with.
I put up this slide here because one of the things I think it's worth taking a second and going back to these grades. So these grades have also been used to drive the innovative school district. And I thought it'd be good for us to talk 1 second, since we're on the issue of grades about this. So innovative school system district, right? You help me with this if I get it, wrong.
Sure.
But the whole concept here is that, okay, we've lettered, we've graded these schools, and after a few years, if they're not making any progress, the state is going to take them over. And so the innovative school district takeover, also a failed program in other states, means that they fire the principal, they fire the teachers, they hire somebody that's from Raleigh, or at least supervised from Raleigh. Yeah. And they send them to the school and they take it over, and they're going to, as you said, miraculously turn it around just simply based on a new philosophy and new staff. So this happened this past year. You remember they took over the school in Robeson County. It was a hostile takeover. The school board had a choice of either closing the school or allowing the state to take it over. They took it over. So Rob, your organization, Billy Ball and Greg have all talked about this. So what happened? Nothing.
Yeah, the school Southside Asheville in Robeson County was the first one, and it was sort of a sad situation because there were other schools that had been identified for this takeover. And make no mistake, this isn't just about the state taking over the schools. This is about taking the school away from the local district and turning it over to a private management company, basically, that really like one of the companies that it could be a for-profit company, could be a nonprofit company, but it's not really part of the state. And we actually have had a model in the past that had been very successful for troubled schools of state employed DPI, Department of Public Instruction staff coming in and providing special services and needs to help get a school back on its feet again. And that to me is a perfect role for the public school system, state school system to play. But this notion of turning it over to private management companies that would come in and affect some sort of miraculous turnaround, it's been tried in several states. It's been very ineffective. Tennessee actually moved away from it because it was so ineffective. And again, these are
very expensive. They spent, we spent $1 million on this one school 1 year, right. And the scores, the grade that I wanted to make sure the public got was that they had an F before the takeover, and they had a school grade of F after the takeover. And in the meantime, we had lots of children's lives who were impacted, teachers, parents, the community has been distraught. And the real thing that bothers me is that these children have not been able to get the academic grounding they've needed. And it proves the point you made earlier, Rob. You cannot turn a child's life around academically in 8 or 9 months without really dealing with the root causes of in our school system, that the children need other services. They need other opportunities to grow and heal. They need medical attention. Many times their families have family members unemployed or working at very low wages, which impacts their housing stability. So it's really a complicated issue. And I think that sometimes for me personally, on a personal note, that bothers me is that I think it's insulting to take a very complex process of educating and instructing and teaching children and impacting families in their lives and treat it as if it is a widget that we can just apply a certain amount of effort and money and it'll be okay. It's not true. It's insulting.
This consumerism thing I was talking to you about, I mean, the best public schools we know, they're really community institutions. They're places where everybody comes together. The best public schools have lots of parent involvement. Even if the parents are working 3 jobs and they've got a tough situation at home, there are folks who have made it work, public school systems that have made it work, where they brought in a large share of the parents to make it really a communal joint enterprise of making their system work. When you bring in this model that we're run by a company and it's a management company, it's this consumerism. It's a different relationship between the parents and the kids and their school than it is when it is a shared enterprise. It's something I consume. It's a product I buy for as low a possible price. So I think that's another element of all this it's very disconcerting, and I think in the long run problematic for this whole notion of the one thing we know is that so far the innovative school district idea has not gone very well, and really the only reason the folks in Robeson County ended up being taken over was because they just didn't have the political will or the skill or the might to fight back. There were schools identified in Durham County and in Wayne County that had been targeted for an ISD takeover, and the parents in the school and the kids and everybody got organized and said, hell no, we don't want this. We don't want to be taken over by a private company. We'd like some help to make our school work better, but we don't need that. And so far they've been successful. And indeed, at the state legislature, they've kind of backed down a little bit off this model. There were plans to force several more of these takeovers next year. It's kind of been put a little bit on hold. It remains to be seen really how far this ISD idea is going to go, but it remains enormously problematic. We're hoping, I mean, for the sake of those children at Southside Asheville in Robeson County, that they will have better results in their second year, and their indications they're doing better. But I think it's pretty clear that this is not the answer to what ails our struggling schools. And we pretty much knew what to do. They need more resources. They need more help. They need more support. They need more specialists. We know what to do. This is just a way to try to do it on the cheap. And that speaks to what so much of this is really about, and what we really haven't touched on is that
Oh, yes.
the reality of public education is that it costs money to do right. It is the single largest item in the state budget every year, as it should be, because there's nothing that we do that's more important. But over the last decade, North Carolina has dramatically reduced the amount that it spends on public education, in both per pupil, our teacher salaries. You adjust for inflation, it's way down. We're way behind, for instance, South Carolina now when it comes to how we spend on per pupil. And being unable to disguise that fact, the people behind it have convinced themselves and tried to convince others that the solution to that problem, or the solution to that situation, is that we're gonna figure out ways to be smarter about it and get more bang for the buck. And so that's what these privatization schemes are often billed as. They're part of a way to fix the system with fewer dollars, to get better results and to squeeze better results out of schools with fewer dollars. And, you know, not surprisingly, it hadn't worked very well. And I don't think anybody has any illusion that, at least who's paying attention, that it will in the long run. So
well,
I would just a classic example of that.
I'll add a couple of comments quickly there, Rob, which is that one of the things that we see as even in the voucher movement, when we look at where vouchers are going and where they're not going, and what we find is that people who choose private education in general are choosing very high-end programs, and they have the money to do so. So what we've created with some of these voucher programs, which is sad, is the low end, a cheaper, if you would, approach to programs that are primarily sponsored often by churches, in the church basement, in the education wing, without certified teachers always being part of the requirement. But we know that with as people's means, as their income increases, if you look at middle and upper income levels of people who choose private education, they're choosing very strong, academically strong programs that mirror what we see in the public education. So I feel like we're offering this on the cheap, but we're offering choice, if you would, in a very mid to low quality way. And that seems to me that, once again, undermining a segment of our population by saying that we're going to give you choice and we're going to give you opportunities to go to charters and voucher schools, but they are not meeting the same quality level in terms of certified teachers, in terms of programs, and the end result is that many of these children will be left into a situation where they'll have a hard time competing for scholarships and competing for placement in appropriate four-year colleges. And so it seems like another backdoor way of really minimizing and lowering the quality of an education we promised in our Constitution to a big segment of kids.
It's a bit of a subject change, but I think it relates to the same point that I've always been struck by in recent years, is that there was a time in this country in which public schools and public school buildings were substantial edifices. They sort of symbolized the pride of the community. Your public school building, there was art involved in actually constructing it and making it a kind of space that we would want to use for decades. The folks who we often do find ourselves debating, the folks in the conservative think tanks here in Raleigh, have written at great length so-called exposés on wasteful spending in public education. And among the things that they really don't like are this idea of investing and making solid, lasting public school buildings that'll be there for 100 years. They write incessantly about the need for cutting costs in public education, cutting costs in school construction. I think it's sort of symbolic. That was, again, public school was a place where the community came together. Now it's treated more as a consumer product that it's like we relate to it like we relate to Lowe's or Home Depot, instead of like something that we're all in together. And I think we
used to drive people
shoddy facilities and things like that, poor school buses, all those kinds of things.
I remember literally that would be the first thing you do. If you were moving to a new town, riding around, or you were having guests or visitors, you took them over to see the high school and look at the football field and the stadium. It was, and they have been traditionally the meeting place in the community where everybody came together over at the high school.
Not just about schools, but lots of important community events.
It was the center of the town, and I think you're really right about that. But the thing about it is I guess I'm trying to say is that people who do have financial comfort do not choose cheap education for their children.
No.
They do not. I think that what I think is most disingenuous about this scheme of some of these programs is that we are offering you choice, but we're offering you really a lower end model of a good education. And I think that's disingenuous. I think we're not truly thinking that you can take $4,200 a year and really choose the education for your child that they deserve. You cannot. Now, yeah, you and I, we are employed right now, thank goodness. And maybe we could take that $4,200 and add $5,000 or $6,000 to it, and we could purchase an education for our kids that we are proud of. So we are really, once again, I think, not being ethical and not being honest to the public, that we are, on top of wanting everybody out of government schools, we are also wanting to provide many children in our community an unequal education, and we want to do it cheaply, and that's really undermines everything we say. So Rob, back to your list. I've sidetracked you so many times. I apologize.
I think I've probably gotten through most of it. One thing I did have in the list that we've alluded to previously was how charters and vouchers bear many striking similarities to mid-20th century resistance to school integration. There's just a lot, frankly, there are a lot of direct links you can draw between the individuals involved in the movement, both familial and historical, organizational, between the folks who are driving this thing today that they call school choice and maybe have done a much better job of, let's say, camouflaging their ultimate intent when it comes to resegregating our public schools. I can't overestimate or can't overstate how important the issue of racial segregation in our public school system, what a big problem that is, and how we have really lost a lot of momentum that we had to address that issue. We made a lot of progress in this state, in this country, 40, 50 years ago, and we have really retreated, and this choice movement has played a really big role in it. And again, obviously schools are not the be all and end all. They can't solve all of our problems when it comes to a society that's a true melting pot. We've got housing discrimination. We've got so many barriers that stand in the way of the kind of integrated society that would be truly healthy. But there's no doubt that the schools have played a big role in this, and this movement, so-called school choice, has played a big role in taking us backwards in that realm. And we're going to pay the price, just as we're going to pay the price for the disinvestment in our kids. So many kids now not being able to go to schools with adequate resources, with fully supported teachers and the like, with adequate facilities. We're going to pay the price for that, and we're going to pay the price socially and politically and in so many other ways as a result of allowing ourselves to go back into our racially segregated camps. And so it's an unfortunate development. It's something we're going to have to redouble our efforts to overcome. I do think that ultimately I think it's going to be okay. I think we have the wherewithal and the resources and the commitment on the side of folks who believe in public education, who believe in an integrated society, to reverse this trend that we've seen in recent decades. But it's going to be a challenge.
Well, Rob, I really do appreciate you ending on a kind of positive note, because I think one of the things that I don't want us to end today without saying is that to the public is, while we are very active in pointing out the things that have been done to attack public schools, I think we got to make sure we explain to the public and show to the public that public schools are doing great. We have some of the most qualified teachers we've ever had. We have the most board certified teachers in the country in North Carolina. We have dedicated teachers and very actively involved parents. And we have one of the highest graduation rates with the toughest standards. We have in North Carolina some of the toughest curriculum standards in the nation. And our kids are, for the most part, meeting these expectations. And they're doing pretty good. Our kids are competing nationally for many, quote, Ivy League schools, or getting scholarships, or they're succeeding. And the drumbeat, I think, that we hear too often from those other organizations are that our schools are failing, they're terrible places to be, you need to get your kids out of there. And I think it's just a scheme to privatize our schools based on either because you don't think government has a role, or because you think there's a way to make money in a private sector. I will use as an example something that I think brings us to the end of our conversation, and it talks about common good. I interviewed Natalie Beyer last week with the Durham School Board. Right. Durham School Board a couple years ago decided to save money and to privatize their janitorial services. So they went out into the private sector because we could do it cheaper. They bought services from the public. They found out pretty quickly that there wasn't quite the same quality of the services. The janitors who had always been Mr. Smith at so-and-so elementary, been there for 20 years, cared about each teacher, knew the children in the hallway, cared about how the cafeteria looked. He was gone. And instead, there was a company that came in late at night, did all this work, and left. And what I found is that the quality of the service did not really improve. And then they also started thinking about how was that investing back into the community. So they have brought all these services back in. They now are back offering their own janitorial services, hiring people at livable wages, paying them benefits to be a part of the community. So they are saying back, no, this is a community, and we want to invest back in our community. We're getting better services. We're being more ethical. We're caring for the common good of our community. We're job creators now. And guess what? Mr. Smith is back. He knows every teacher's name, knows to the kids, and he cares about that your classroom is not full of dust, that he cares about the kids having a clean environment. So that really kind of inspired me. I was really excited to hear that Durham is doing that, because I think it's a little micro example of some of the things you were talking about, how we spend our money, how we invest in the common good, and can we do things on the cheap, and does it really matter? So if you look at charter schools, they do not have to have half of their teachers certified. Public schools, all teachers are certified. Charter schools, they do not have to follow a curriculum. Public schools, yes, they have to follow a state-sanctioned and adopted curriculum. So when we go down that list of things, are our kids really getting the benefit of an education on the cheap? It's very questionable. And in fact, your wonderful Chris Nordstrom, let me see if I can go back and find this fabulous, there it is. Yeah. Here's what he created. You can see this was from your organization. Yeah, and we got Chris's permission to use it because look at it.
Right. The performance of kids meeting or exceeding expected annual growth, actually doing better in traditional public schools, notwithstanding all of the attacks, all of the underfunding, all of the propaganda about how they're failing, they're actually doing better. And it speaks this fact that we know what to do. This is hard. It's hard work, but it ain't rocket science. Investing adequately in public schools, supporting teachers. I think that's why there's such a stubborn resistance from so many people in the public education world. They're saying, no way, man. You're not going to do this to our public education system. We're going to fight back. We're going to regain the momentum and control over the future of our public education system. And that's what's so important about the work Public Schools First is doing, the facts that we're trying to shed, light that we're trying to shed on what's going on at the General Assembly. I really believe in my heart this is a sort of last gasp maybe of the privatizers and of the resegregators. And so they're going to have their little day in the sun here. But I feel that in the long run, truth and justice is going to win out in this
Well,
race.
I hope so. And you know, one thing I'll tell you is that research, just like the stuff here that Chris Nordstrom is doing, if people are interested in looking at the facts and the data, we know that kids who go to school together, who learn about each other's cultural issues, who learn about each other's differences in race and class, that kids who are in an integrated, healthy environment learn how to live with each other, how to get along, how to understanding. They're more empathetic. They're better co-workers in the workplace. They grow up and they go out into the world that is diverse, in the workplaces that are diverse, and they are more productive, better workers. And in fact, what we know from all the research recently and looking at workplaces is that the number one reason that most people lose their job has not to do with their job performance, has to do with how they get along with each other. Now, a recent U.S. Chamber report showed that's the number one reason most people aren't happy in their jobs or lose their jobs.
Yeah.
We don't know how to get along with each other. So where do you learn that at? In the sandbox, on the playground, on the football field, in the classroom. So I do hope as you, that when parents really start thinking about how do I give my child that advantage they need in the future, that it can't just be, did they learn how to do algebra? Can they speak a second language? Can they understand when to use the Oxford comma? But it has to be, can they understand the references in the world culturally? Do they understand how people in countries and societies have developed and grown? They have to have an appreciation for that. So I'm hoping that you and I and all our colleagues can keep sending out the message of the best choice you can make is public schools, and the best choice you can make is to choose a school that is integrated and diverse. That is a gift you can give your child. And I think that it's not just a philosophical view, Rob, because you and your colleagues have shown research report after research report that the facts also show that integration works, that segregation does not, that healthy schools that have wraparound services work. Isolated schools where poverty is used as a tool against children does not work. So there is a place for the common good. And so I'm going to give you the last comment, Rob, because you have been at this from all angles. You've been at this in personal level. You have a wife who's involved in public education. You've had children in the public education system. You've observed all this. What is the call to action you want to give all of us parents and grandparents and citizens out there? What do we need to do this next coming year or years to really protect and save our public education system?
Well, there's so much to do, but obviously participating, learning the facts, obviously choosing when you have that opportunity to send your children to those schools. But ultimately, I think it comes down to also choosing policymakers and elected officials who share your point of view. That's critically important. We need to have a bit of a shift in the way North Carolina state government is approaching this issue. When, again, as I say, when South Carolina is spending a lot more on their schools than North Carolina is, something's not quite right, I would say. And so we've got to get back in the game. We've got to realize that our public schools are the single most important thing we spend money on as a state government. We've got to choose elected officials who share that point of view. And we've got to turn around this notion that we can somehow make our schools better by privatizing them and doing it on the cheap. It's going to take investments. It's going to take a long-term commitment. It's going to take stick-to-itiveness. And it's going to take a willingness to engage in the debate and to outlast some of the folks on the other side, to engage with them and show them while they're taking us in the wrong direction, and to persist because they're persistent as well. They've got a lot of funding behind them. We're going to have to fight. It's a real battle, but there's nothing more we could do that's more important. So I'm optimistic. I think we're sort of turning the corner again, thanks to groups like Public Schools First. So just stay engaged and stay tuned.
Well, very good advice, and I love your positivity and your uplifting comments here at the end. And I will also say that as we end, you know, many great scholars over the last decades, hundreds of years, have talked about the value of an educated population. And I loved where, was it John Adams or someone who said, you know, there should be a free school, free to everybody, regardless of your class, your race, your standing in life, a free, strong education. And in 1840, in North Carolina, we wrote that, you know, we did that. We opened the first public schools, and ever since then, we've even have it in our state constitution that we think it's so important. Here in the South, in North Carolina, in our state constitution, we say that every child deserves a fair, strong public education. And Rob, thanks to you and your colleagues and others and all of our advocacy friends, we are all saying that we're going to modify that to add integrated,
Amen.
Diverse, well-funded public education. And then investing in our teachers is the right thing to do. I had a teacher tell me the other day, if you had a choice of investing, paying, you know, to educate and then paying your doctors really a cheap amount, a very low price for their services, would you do that? Would you educate doctors on the cheap? Would you want a medical professional to show up and say, I'm barely, you know, qualified. I haven't had a really great education. I got, you know, but I'm here. Or would you want a well-trained, well-educated, the best opportunity to learn, a physician to be on your service? And so I think that's the same thing we're talking about. Teachers, we paid them too long on the cheap. It's time that we invest in them professionally, and we make sure that our kids, all children, have the same access to a high quality education. Okay, so we could go on forever. You are really wonderful to talk to. Thank you. It has been an honor for us to have you participate in the conference, an honor to have this conversation with you today. You are an inspirational person to many of us in the community for your strong, bold vision, the way that you stand out and you speak up and you say the right things and you do the right work for our state. And Rob, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I hope you have a great day. And thanks to our public for joining in, and catch us on YouTube with Rob Schofield, NC Policy Watch. See you later.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Keep the faith. See you.